The Katyusha screamed across the Ukrainian steppe. Not fired. Not launched. Screamed. Wehrmacht Obergefreiter Klaus Mittler pressed his face into frozen mud. The sound wasn't mechanical. It was organic. Alive. Like the earth itself was tearing apart at the seams. His unit had survived the Blitzkrieg. They'd rolled through Poland in weeks, France in 6. Russia was supposed to collapse in 3 months. That was 18 months ago. Now Klaus was counting seconds between impacts. The rockets came in salvos of 16. Always 16. The Soviets called it Stalin's organ. Klaus called it something else. The sound that turned veterans into children. The first rocket hit 200 meters left, then 150, then 100, walking toward their position like a drunk giant looking for something to step on. The 16th rocket hit the communication trench. Klaus heard Unterscharführer Weber screaming, not in pain, in terror. The kind that breaks something fundamental in a man's brain. Weber had survived Stalingrad. He'd held a building for 6 days against waves of Soviet infantry. Now, he was curled in a ball, sobbing like a 5-year-old. "Shut him up!" hissed Feldwebel-Kruger. "They'll hear us!" Klaus looked across no man's land. Somewhere out there, Soviet observers were already calling in corrections. The next salvo would walk right through their positions. 16 rockets, each one carrying 40 pounds of high explosive designed to turn human beings into red mist. The irony wasn't lost on Klaus. The Wehrmacht prided itself on precision, calculated fire missions, careful targeting, mathematical certainty. The Russians just pointed their rocket trucks in a general direction and let physics sort it out. It worked. God help them all, it worked. Weber finally went quiet. Not because he'd regained control, because something inside his head had simply snapped clean through. He sat staring at nothing, lips moving in silent conversation with ghosts only he could see. Klaus checked his watch. 03:47 hours. The Russians would attack at dawn, wave after wave of men in brown coats running across open ground like it was a Sunday stroll in the park. Half of them wouldn't have rifles. They'd pick them up from the bodies of the men in front of them. It should have been suicide. Every principle of modern warfare said it should have been suicide. But the math was simple. The Wehrmacht had precision. The Russians had people. Lots and lots of people. And people, Klaus had learned, were the most renewable resource on the Eastern Front. In the distance, he could hear them singing. The report sat in a manila folder marked Vertraulich in red ink. Top secret. Restricted. Buried so deep in Wehrmacht intelligence files that it took 40 years for historians to dig it out. Intelligence assessment. Eastern Front tactical reality versus doctrine. Filed by Oberst Heinrich Staudt, Fremde Heere, Ost, March 15, 1942. Staudt had been career intelligence, Prussian Military Academy, Staff College, 20 years analyzing enemy capabilities. He knew how to write reports that wouldn't get him shot. This wasn't one of them. The capture ratios told the story. Summer 1941. 325 Soviet prisoners for every German captured. Spring 1942. 12-1. Collapsing like a stone through black water. Not because German soldiers were surrendering more, because Soviet soldiers were surrendering less. Much less. The traditional explanation was comfortable. Better training, improved equipment, streamlined command structure. Staudt's report cut through every comfortable lie. Section 4, paragraph 12. Enemy personnel demonstrate systematic resistance to capture attempts. Wounded combatants continue aggressive action despite severe trauma. Professional language for an unprofessional reality. Soviet soldiers weren't just fighting until wounded. They were fighting until actually dead. Section 7, paragraph 3. Commissar enforcement protocols appear to modify standard behavioral responses to tactical pressure. Personnel demonstrate reduced surrender probability under all engagement scenarios. Translation: the Reds were more afraid of their own officers than they were of German bullets. The report included testimony from Wehrmacht interrogators, men who understood fear, pain, and the breaking point of human resistance. Hauptmann Friedrich Kessel, 23rd Infantry Division. The Russian prisoners are different, not just their equipment or training, something fundamental. They look at you like they've already died once and didn't mind it much. Oberleutnant Josef Zimmermann, 4th Panzer Division, had one prisoner badly wounded, kept trying to bite my interpreter, not to escape, not to resist questioning, just bite, like an animal. We had to shoot him. Page after page of testimony describing an enemy that operated outside accepted parameters of military psychology. Soldiers engineered somehow to function beyond normal human limitations. Stout's conclusion was buried in technical language, but the meaning was clear. The Soviet Commissar system didn't just punish desertion. It punished the families of deserters. It punished the units that produced deserters. It punished the commanders who failed to prevent it. It created a web of terror so complete that surrender became literally unthinkable. German military doctrine assumed rational actors making rational decisions under pressure. Soviet doctrine assumed something else entirely. That rational thought could be beaten out of people, systematically, scientifically, until only obedience remained. The Wehrmacht was fighting an enemy that had weaponized desperation itself, and it was working. Devastatingly. Uncomfortably. Working. Stout's commanding officer read the first section and locked the folder in his personal safe. Some intelligence was too dangerous to acknowledge, because acknowledging it meant accepting that German tactical philosophy was based on fighting civilized opponents who shared civilized assumptions about human behavior. The Soviets had abandoned civilized assumptions, and terror, Stout had learned, was winning. Gefreiter Hans Bellmann crouched in the rubble of what had been an apartment building. His Kar 98K felt inadequate in his hands. Everything felt inadequate in Stalingrad. The city didn't follow normal rules. Buildings weren't just defensive positions. They were fortresses. Every room a bunker. Every stairwell a killing ground. Every piece of debris cover for another Red Army soldier who fought like he'd been carved from the wreckage itself. The building across the street had been cleared 4 times. 4 separate Wehrmacht units had gone room to room, floor to floor. 4 times they'd reported the position secure. 4 times Soviet soldiers had emerged from somewhere and resumed firing. "They're not human," whispered Obergefreiter Müller. He'd been Hans's squad leader since France. Steady, professional, unshakable. Now his hands trembled when he thought no one was looking. Normal soldiers hid behind cover. These Russians crawled inside it. They turned themselves into part of the battlefield, indistinguishable from rubble until they opened fire. Then they disappeared again, absorbed back into the destruction like ghosts made of brick and steel. The mortars came down and erased an entire building. High, explosive rounds that turned windows into wounds and walls into powder. The structure swayed, collapsed, ground down to constituent elements. Silence followed. Then, from somewhere in the debris pile, a machine gun opened fire. Hans pressed his face against frozen concrete. The building was gone, erased. But the machine gun kept firing, methodical, precise, as though mounted on solid ground instead of 20 tons of collapsed masonry. His company commander, Hauptmann Kröger, had tried to explain it in tactical terms. Superior terrain knowledge, prepared, positions, underground tunnel networks, rational explanations for an irrational situation. Hans had stopped believing rational explanations 3 weeks ago. around the time he'd watched a dead Soviet soldier sit up and throw a grenade after taking 3 rifle rounds to the chest. The man died throwing it. The grenade killed 2 Wehrmacht soldiers and wounded 3 more. Movement in the rubble. Brown uniform the same color as brick dust. Face smeared with ash and blood until it looked like debris. The Soviet soldier wasn't running for cover. He was running toward Hans's position, across open ground, through concentrated rifle fire, taking hits and ignoring them like they were raindrops. Hans put his front sight on the man's chest and squeezed the trigger. The round hit center mass. The soldier staggered, kept running. Hans worked the bolt, fired again, another hit. The man was still coming. At 50 meters, Hans could see his face. Young, maybe 18, eyes that belonged on someone much older, much deader. His left arm hung useless at his side. His right hand held a bundle of stick grenades, 20 meters. Hans fired his last round. The bullet took the boy in the head, snapped it back like a whip crack. The body should have fallen. Instead, it stumbled forward 3 more steps before physics finally caught up with biology. The grenades exploded 6 feet from Hans's position. Muller was dead. Weber was screaming into his radio. The city had consumed another Wehrmacht squad. Hans reloaded with shaking hands. Open bolt, insert clip, close bolt, muscle memory from 1,000 training repetitions. In the distance, Soviet voices rose in harmony, a melody that echoed off ruins like a funeral hymn for a city that refused to die. And Hans recognized it now. Not a song of victory, a song of mourning. The Soviets weren't celebrating. They were grieving for themselves, for everything they'd lost and everything they were about to lose. But they kept fighting anyway, because mourning didn't require surrender. And surrender wasn't in their vocabulary. Hans checked his ammunition. 4 rounds left. He'd need to make them count. The Pervitin arrived in unmarked wooden crates. Wehrmacht Medical Corps stamped them with eagles before distribution to frontline units. 35 million tablets of pure methamphetamine. Industrial-strength courage manufactured in German pharmaceutical plants. Oberarzt Dr. Klaus Hermann had distributed combat stimulants since the Poland campaign. Caffeine pills, glucose tablets, standard medical support. This was different. C10, H15N, phenylmethylaminopropane, street name, crystal meth. Military designation, Panzerschokolade, tank chocolate. 1 tablet eliminated fatigue for 12 hours. 2 tablets eliminated fear. 3 tablets eliminated judgment. But by then, judgment was a luxury the Wehrmacht couldn't afford. Hermann's medical training screamed warnings. Cardiac stress, psychological dependency, permanent neurological damage. He'd written reports documenting the side effects. Soldiers collapsing after stimulants wore off. Psychotic breaks. Violent outbursts directed at their own comrades. His commanding officer had filed those reports in a folder marked Nicht Beachten. Do not observe. Military euphemism for information that didn't exist. The demand kept growing. Not because the war was getting harder, because the war was getting longer. And longer wars required chemical solutions to human limitations. German tactical theory emphasized precision over endurance. Quick, decisive actions that ended before human factors became relevant. But the Eastern Front didn't end. It stretched across 2,000 kilometers of forest, steppes, and city, consuming men and materials at rates that exceeded every planning assumption. The solution was elegant. If men couldn't sustain the required tempo, chemistry would sustain it for them. Artificial alertness, manufactured, aggression, synthetic fearlessness injected directly into the bloodstream. Hermann had seen the results. Soldiers who fought for 72 hours straight without sleep. Tank crews engaging multiple targets while their vehicles burned around them. infantry advancing through artillery barrages like they were walking through summer rain. He'd also seen the crashes. Men who collapsed mid-sentence and couldn't be awakened for 18 hours. Soldiers who forgot their own names but could strip and reassemble their weapons blindfolded. Veterans who tried to strangle their officers with bare hands. The Wehrmacht medical manual classified these as temporary adverse reactions. Hermann classified them as predictable symptoms of systematic drug abuse. But systematic drug abuse had become official policy, which made his classification irrelevant. Army Group Center consumed 30 million tablets in 4 months, roughly 200 tablets per soldier per month, enough methamphetamine to keep a normal human being awake for a week. Wehrmacht soldiers weren't normal human beings anymore. They were chemical weapon systems disguised as people. Soldiers developed tolerance. They needed larger doses for the same effects. Larger doses produced more severe side effects. More severe side effects required medical intervention. Medical intervention reduced combat effectiveness. The cycle was unsustainable. Also, unstoppable. Hermann watched his soldiers become something else, not better, not worse. Chemically modified human beings who functioned according to pharmaceutical parameters instead of biological ones. Weapon systems that happened to wear Wehrmacht uniforms. Effective, terrifyingly effective, right up until the moment they weren't. Chemical courage had a half-life. Hermann had calculated it precisely. 12 hours of artificial fearlessness, followed by 18 hours of chemical depression. The Wehrmacht was running on borrowed time, synthetic time that accumulated interest with every tablet consumed. The bill would come due eventually. It always did. The staff conference was scheduled for 0800 hours. By 0815, 2 of Germany's most senior generals were discussing the technical details of killing each other with pistols. General Feldmarschall Günther von Kluge commanded Army Group Center. General Oberst Heinz Guderian commanded 2nd Panzer Army, between them over 500,000 German soldiers preparing for Operation Citadel, the summer offensive that would determine the future of the war. The argument started professionally. Kluge questioned Guderian's deployment schedules. Guderian questioned Kluge's understanding of armored warfare. Standard friction between commanders. Then Kluge made a mistake. He questioned Guderian's courage. Perhaps the Panzer General has grown cautious in his old age, Kluge suggested. His tone was conversational, diplomatic, absolutely poisonous. Guderian went very still. The conference room fell, silent. Staff officers suddenly discovered urgent business with their paperwork. Maps became fascinating. Pencils required careful examination. Would the Field Marshal care to elaborate? Guderian's voice was soft, professional, deadly. Every Prussian officer recognized the tone. Honor was at stake. Personal honor. The kind that could only be satisfied with blood. I mean nothing personal, Kluge backtracked. Too late. The words were spoken. Witnesses had heard them. Military protocol demanded satisfaction. Of course not, Guderian replied. Nevertheless, I believe clarification is required. Perhaps the Field Marshal would join me for a private discussion. Private discussion, euphemism for formal challenge. Kluge accepted, rather than lose face in front of his staff. Certainly, Kluge said. Shall we schedule a meeting at dawn? I believe there's suitable ground behind the motor pool. 2 senior generals preparing to kill each other while the Red Army massed for the largest tank battle in human history. It was either comedy or tragedy, possibly both. The duel never happened. Hitler intervened personally, summoning both men to Rastenburg, but the damage was done. Word spread through the officer corps like wildfire and became legend. Then myth. Then cautionary tale. Guderian's tactical assessments were correct. The Wehrmacht lacked resources for major offensive operations. German industry couldn't replace equipment losses. Citadel was strategic suicide, disguised as tactical boldness. But saying so was professionally unacceptable. It implied defeatism, cowardice, lack of faith in German superiority. So Guderian spoke in euphemisms while Klug heard insubordination. The Soviet command structure didn't have this problem. Stalin shot generals who disagreed with him. Efficient, brutal, absolutely effective. Dead generals couldn't challenge orders or demand personal satisfaction. The Wehrmacht couldn't shoot its own generals. That would violate honor, codes that predated the Nazi Party by centuries. So they challenged each other to duels instead, turning military planning into theater and strategy into performance art. Rigid systems broke under pressure. The Wehrmacht had confused rigidity with strength and flexibility with weakness. Classic German engineering mistake applied to human institutions. Honor was a luxury the Wehrmacht couldn't afford, but they kept paying for it anyway, one challenged duel at a time. Senior Lieutenant Yuri Petrov pressed his belly against frozen earth and crawled toward the German positions. Not toward cover behind them, toward the positions themselves. Right up to the edge where Wehrmacht sentries stood watch. This violated every principle of sniper doctrine. Snipers operated from concealed positions at extended range. They stayed behind friendly lines, protected, supported by observation teams. Petrov was crawling to within grenade range of enemy soldiers, alone, unsupported, completely cut off from any extraction possibility. The German positions followed standard defensive protocols: overlapping fields of fire, prepared fighting holes, 3 rows of concertina wire designed to channel attackers into pre-registered killing zones. Perfect against conventional assault tactics. Useless against snipers who crawled underneath and established firing positions inside the defensive perimeter. The technique required specific personality characteristics. Absolute disregard for personal safety. Complete acceptance of mission parameters over survival instincts. Systematic suppression of fear responses. Petrov's family lived in a collective housing unit outside Stalingrad. His wife worked in a munitions factory. His daughter attended state school. All conditional on his combat performance. Failure meant collective punishment. Cowardice meant family deportation. Capture meant assumption of treason. So Petrov crawled to the edge of German positions and waited. Not because he was brave, because he was more afraid of Soviet officers than German bullets. Dawn approached. German sentries would be changed at 0600 hours. Standard rotation that created predictable vulnerabilities for observers who positioned themselves correctly. Petrov had positioned himself correctly, inside the perimeter, below ground level, invisible until the moment of engagement. The first target appeared at 0603 hours. Wehrmacht Obergefreiter adjusting his equipment load in what he assumed was a secure area. Petrov's shot took him center mass. 1 round, 1 target. Perfect efficiency. The German response was immediate and logical. Counterfire directed toward distant positions that might conceal enemy marksmen, not toward positions inside their own perimeter that definitely did. His second target appeared at 0615 hours. Wehrmacht officer using field glasses to scan for snipers. Looking in every direction except down, where a Soviet marksman lay 3 meters from his fighting hole, another single shot. Another dead German. His third target was a Wehrmacht medic attempting to treat the wounded officer. Petrov hesitated. Medical personnel weren't legitimate military targets under Geneva protocols. Then he remembered his daughter's school photograph, his wife's factory identification card, all conditional on mission effectiveness. The medic died at 0627 hours. Petrov's position was finally discovered at 0640 hours. A Wehrmacht patrol found him by accident, nearly stepping on his concealed fighting hole. By then, he'd fired 17 rounds and achieved 11 confirmed kills. The patrol didn't take prisoners, didn't attempt capture. They shot him repeatedly, made sure he was dead. then shot him several more times to make sure he stayed dead. Petrov's body was left where it fell. The Wehrmacht didn't have procedures for disposing of snipers who materialized inside defensive perimeters, but they developed procedures quickly, and within weeks, Wehrmacht, snipers were adopting identical tactics, crawling to the edge of Soviet positions, accepting expendability as an operational cost. Both sides had discovered the same truth. The most effective sniper positions were the most suicidal ones. Maximum lethality required maximum expendability. War had become an industrial process that consumed human beings as raw materials. Soviet snipers who crawled to hell's front door were simply another component in the machinery. Expendable components, replaceable components, highly effective components. The hobnails conducted cold like precision instruments designed for systematic torture. German engineering at its finest. Steel cleats hammered into boot soles for superior traction on ice and snow. Perfect for rapid advances across frozen terrain. Also perfect for conducting sub-zero temperatures directly into the feet of the soldiers wearing them. Gefreiter Klaus Mittler felt the iron-leaching warmth from his toes through wool socks that might as well have been tissue paper. German textile science had produced the finest military uniforms in Europe, none of which helped when the temperature dropped to 40 below and your boots became thermal conduits that turned your feet into blocks of ice. The Russians wore felt boots, crude, unsophisticated, manufactured from pressed wool and animal fat. No precision engineering, no quality control, but they kept feet warm in temperatures that turned German precision into German frostbite. Klaus wiggled his toes inside his boots and felt nothing. Complete numbness. He pulled them off and looked at his feet. White. Wax white. Dead white. The color of meat stored in freezers too long. He pressed a fingernail against his big toe and watched the impression remain after he pulled his finger away. Definitely frostbite. Probably severe. Possibly permanent. He began the prescribed treatment. Gentle massage to restore circulation. Professional medical procedure applied under suboptimal conditions. The pain was extraordinary. Not sharp. Not burning. Deep, grinding agony that felt like his bones were being crushed from the inside. German precision-manufactured pain produced by German precision-manufactured boots. Around him, other soldiers were conducting the same ritual. 30 men discovering feet in various stages of cold injury. Professional soldiers reduced to invalids by their own equipment. Military specifications demanded steel cleats for traction. Professional standards mandated equipment that met engineering requirements instead of human needs. So, German soldiers marched across the frozen steppe in boots that systematically destroyed their feet, while Soviet soldiers marched in, felt that kept them warm and mobile. Klaus stood up and tested his balance. His feet felt like blocks of wood attached to his legs. No sensation below the ankles. Just dead weight he'd have to carry through whatever the day brought. He checked his rifle. Kar 98K loaded and Kar ready. 5 rounds of precision-manufactured ammunition. German engineering at its finest. The ammunition would work perfectly. German engineering guaranteed it. But Klaus wasn't sure he could work at all. His feet were equipment failures disguised as body parts. He looked at his watch. 04:45 hours. Dawn approaching. The Soviet attack would come regardless of his foot problems. Professional soldiers didn't get sick days. They got orders. Klaus chambered around and waited for dawn. His feet couldn't feel the ground beneath them, but his hands could still operate a rifle. His eyes could still acquire targets. German precision hadn't completely failed, just partially, which might be enough to keep him alive until the next equipment failure finished the job. At least the boots worked as designed. The Tiger II cost 321,500 Reichsmarks. For the same price, the Wehrmacht could have purchased 3 Panzer IVs, maintained them for 6 months, and equipped their crews with enough ammunition to fight continuous operations until Christmas. Instead, they got one tank. 70 tons of precision-engineered German steel that broke down every 40 kilometers and required 2 recovery vehicles to extract from muddy terrain. The specifications were genuinely impressive. 185mm frontal armor, 88mm main gun, sophisticated transmission, advanced fire control optics. Engineering perfection applied to battlefield requirements that it was never designed to meet. Because battlefield requirements on the Eastern Front included traveling hundreds of kilometers across terrain that ranged from swamp to desert, operating in temperatures from 40 above to 40 below, running without maintenance facilities or spare parts for extended periods. The Tiger II was designed for none of these conditions. It was designed for short-range engagements on improved roads with full logistical support. Oberst Stout documented the tactical mathematics. Each Tiger II required 2 Maybach engines per month of operations, 47 different spare parts maintained in constant inventory, specialized repair personnel trained on Henschel manufacturing specifications, and recovery equipment capable of lifting 70 tons out of mud. None of which existed on the Eastern Front. Meanwhile, Soviet T-34s cost 35,000 rubles. Rough conversion, 8,750 Reichsmarks. 1/3 the price. Mass-produced in factories that prioritized quantity over quality, functionality over sophistication. T-34 specifications were unimpressive. 45mm frontal armor, 76mm main gun, crude transmission, basic optics. But T-34s could travel 500 kilometers without major maintenance. They operated in temperatures from 60 above to 50 below. They could be repaired by peasant mechanics using improvised tools. And they could be replaced. Soviet production lines delivered new ones faster than German anti-tank guns could destroy existing ones. Stout calculated the ratios. 1 Tiger II versus 9 T-34s. Assuming perfect conditions, the Tiger II would win. Superior firepower and armor guaranteed tactical victory. But conditions were never perfect. Ammunition was constantly scarce. Experienced crews were irreplaceable casualties. And tactical victories meant nothing when industrial production favored the enemy by a factor of 9. The Wehrmacht was fighting industrial war with craftsman's logic. Individual weapon systems so superior, they were supposed to compensate for numerical disadvantages. Engineering perfection applied to strategic impossibility. The Tiger II program continued until Germany ran out of materials to build them. Then it continued until Germany ran out of factories. Then it continued until Germany ran out of Germans to crew them. 321,500 Reichsmarks per tank, plus maintenance, plus crew training, plus ammunition, plus recovery operations for the ones that broke down before they reached the front. The mathematics were perfect. The economics were insane. German precision had priced itself out of industrial warfare. Soviet pragmatism had mass-produced victory through acceptable mediocrity. The Tiger II became a monument to engineering excellence that nobody could afford. Perfect weapon systems for wars that nobody was going to win. From 321,500 Reichsmarks to 0 operational capability. German engineering at its finest. Himrod Abbey sat in the Rhineland like a medieval fortress disguised as a monastery. Stone walls that had sheltered monks for 8 centuries. In October 1950, they sheltered something else entirely. 15 former Wehrmacht officers rewriting history with fountain pens and deliberate forgetfulness. The Himrod Memorandum, classified planning session for the new German army that would join NATO forces against Soviet expansion. Professional military assessment conducted by professional military officers. Also the largest historical fraud in modern European history. Oberst Stout had been invited based on his intelligence background and clean service record. The official agenda covered force structure, training procedures, equipment requirements, standard military planning, nothing controversial. The unofficial agenda was different. how to build a new German army without acknowledging what the old German army had learned about warfare, specifically what they'd learned about Soviet tactical effectiveness. General Adolf Heusinger opened the discussion. "Gentlemen, we face a delicate situation. Our American allies require German military expertise, but they also require German military respectability." Translation: tell them what they need to know. Don't tell them what they don't want to hear. The problem was fundamental. German tactical doctrine had evolved through 4 years of direct combat with Soviet forces. That experience was strategically valuable. It was also politically toxic, because acknowledging Soviet effectiveness meant acknowledging German failures, and German failures raised uncomfortable questions about German decisions. So the memorandum would emphasize German successes, technical superiority, tactical innovations that could benefit NATO against Soviet aggression. It would not emphasize German failures. Equipment inadequacy. Systematic underestimation of Soviet capabilities. The discussions continued for 3 days. General Guderian contributed mechanized warfare principles and combined arms theory. He did not contribute assessments of German logistical failures. General Halder provided intelligence methodologies. He did not provide analyses of intelligence failures that had contributed to German defeat. The pattern held throughout. German officers sharing expertise that validated Western military assumptions, while suppressing expertise that challenged those assumptions. Soviet tactical innovations were described as barbaric, uncivilized, violations of accepted military practice, technical language for uncomfortable realities that NATO planners didn't want to address. The fact that barbaric tactics had defeated civilized ones was diplomatically unmentionable. Stout contributed intelligence analyses according to the established pattern: Soviet order of battle, equipment specifications, command structure. He did not contribute his assessments of Soviet psychological warfare, commissar enforcement systems, or expendability doctrine, because they proved that Soviet military effectiveness derived from systematic terror. That terror-based discipline created soldiers who fought more effectively than democracy-based discipline. That abandoning Western military ethics provided tactical advantages that Western ethics couldn't counter. Acknowledging that meant acknowledging something else entirely. That the Wehrmacht had lost because they'd fought a civilized war against uncivilized opponents. That military professionalism was inadequate against military psychopathy. That democracy was tactically inferior to totalitarianism. Those conclusions were strategically unacceptable, so they were systematically eliminated from the historical record. German Eastern Front experience was sanitized, democratized, and repackaged for Western consumption. The Himrod Memorandum became official doctrine for the Bundeswehr, then the foundation for NATO tactical planning against Soviet forces. Western military doctrine based on German assessments that deliberately excluded the most important lessons of German-Soviet combat. The abbey walls had sheltered monks pursuing spiritual truth for 8 centuries. For 3 days in 1950, they sheltered former officers pursuing politically acceptable lies. Both pursuits required faith. Both produced documents that people wanted to believe. The difference was that monastic documents acknowledged their dependence on faith. The Himrod Memorandum presented political necessity as strategic wisdom. History was erased with fountain pens and professional courtesy. Truth became diplomatic liability. Knowledge became political weapon. Memory became strategic threat. The Abbey kept its secrets, as it always had, as it always would. The files remained classified for 40 years, not because they contained military secrets, because they contained military truths that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Soviet tactical doctrine worked brutally, effectively, systematically. It violated every assumption about human behavior in combat, and produced soldiers who fought like machines calibrated for systematic destruction. The Western military establishment couldn't accept that conclusion, because accepting it meant accepting something else. That civilized military doctrine was inadequate against uncivilized opponents. That ethical constraints were tactical liabilities. That democracy was systematically inferior to totalitarianism in producing effective combat soldiers. So the truth was classified, buried, rewritten, replaced with comfortable narratives that preserved institutional assumptions about the relationship between military ethics and military effectiveness. But the mathematics remained unchanged. Capture ratios that collapsed from 325 to 1 down to 12 to 1. Production ratios that favored quantity over quality. Casualty rates that treated human life as industrial input. Soviet forces had weaponized desperation, industrialized terror, and mass-produced soldiers who functioned beyond normal human limitations. And the techniques were all systematically documented in German intelligence reports that were systematically destroyed, suppressed, or locked in filing cabinets marked restricted distribution. NATO doctrine was built on the assumption that democratic soldiers fought better than totalitarian ones, that free men were more effective than enslaved ones, that ethical military systems produced superior results. Soviet battlefield performance contradicted every element of that assumption. But Western military institutions chose to ignore the contradiction. Soviet effectiveness was attributed to equipment, geography, strategic surprise, anything except the systematic abandonment of Western military ethics. German officers who'd fought on the Eastern Front understood the reality. Soviet soldiers were tactically effective because Soviet doctrine had eliminated the human factors that limited Western military performance. Fear, self-preservation, concern for civilian casualties, respect for international law, ethical constraints that made Western soldiers more humane and less effective. The results were mathematically demonstrable, tactically undeniable, strategically unacceptable. So the evidence was classified, the reports buried, the witnesses quietly sidelined. 40 years later, when historians finally gained access to classified files, they discovered what military professionals had known and suppressed since 1945. That the most effective military system of the 20th century was built on systematic terror, industrial brutality, and the complete abandonment of Western military ethics. That civilized military doctrine was inadequate against uncivilized opponents who treated human life as expendable ammunition. That victory required abandoning the moral assumptions that made victory worth achieving. The truth was too dangerous to acknowledge, too uncomfortable to accept, too politically toxic for democratic institutions to survive. So it remained classified, not by government decree, by institutional necessity, by collective agreement that some truths are too dangerous for democratic societies to acknowledge. The Eastern Front proved that organized savagery could defeat civilized warfare. That systematic brutality produced tactical advantages that systematic humanity couldn't counter. Those conclusions remain classified, not in any official sense, but by the 40-year weight of institutional silence. Professional amnesia that protects comfortable assumptions from uncomfortable realities. Because acknowledging the truth means questioning everything democratic societies believe about the relationship between moral superiority and military effectiveness. The files exist, the evidence is documented, the truth is available, but the truth is still classified by necessity, by design, by collective agreement that some knowledge is too dangerous for civilized societies to possess. What they still don't want you to know, civilization lost to organized savagery. And the evidence is still too dangerous to acknowledge. Even now, even today, even when the war has been over for 80 years.